Welcome to Fosbury Flop, a podcast for the crazy ones who are not fond of rules. A podcast about the geniuses who change the world. Alex Sarama, Director of Player Development for the Cleveland Cavaliers, invited me to the Transforming Basketball camp. There, I was able to know how Alex thinks about basketball performance and how Transforming Basketball, the company he leads, helps players, coaches, and organizations make sense of an evidence-based approach, the CLA, constraints-led approach. What I liked the most, however, wasn't any scientific theory or basketball task. It was Alex's constant dedication to the learning of the players and coaches who trusted him. Alex Sarama, welcome to Fosbury Flop.
Marty, it's a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
No, thank you. Thank you very much. First for coming, then for how well have you treated me in the Transforming Basketball camp here in Pescara, but also for all the work you do, like for all the basketball community. Thank you about all of this.
It's a pleasure.
I wanted to share with you a story because I think you can give very good insights. Martí Perarnau, a Catalan writer, in his book, The Tactical Evolution of Football, explains one day in England they created football and they ruled it, they created the rules. As they were the kings, they didn't appreciate any kind of knowledge or any kind of attitude that appreciated knowledge, learning, teaching. So after a long time being exposed to basketball, paddle, and being a bit over Europe, I have created my then popular opinion that being successful as a nation at a sport, it creates a form of life that maybe it makes successful in the short term, but plays against you in the long term. But I think you can give me good insights. What do you think about it?
What an excellent question to start with, Marty. So it's really funny because I actually associate my kind of journey in basketball from coming at that from the complete opposite end of the spectrum, being English, having no background in basketball at the start. I started playing at 12 and I knew no one. When I started coaching, I had zero connections. And then obviously the status of the game in the UK was so far behind that it's actually funny because it was that specific reason that created the motivational climate for me to do everything I'm doing now. Because I knew that with no background, with no connections, I would have to have something so unique if I wanted to make it to the NBA. And it wasn't just that motivated me, of course, but I do remember it being such a significant factor because I always remember people always talking about, oh, he's from England, he can't coach, he doesn't know anything about basketball. And it was great. And I was very glad when people said that because it just provided me with more fuel for the fire, so to speak. But I think now, answering the original question, I think it's something we see a lot in basketball, especially now as I've been sharing these ideas for a few years. I've got a lot of friends in the countries which are traditional powerhouses, you know, in Europe, places like Spain, Lithuania, Serbia. I guess, obviously, you've got the US who will always be there. And it's really interesting because now when we look at growth of the constraints-led approach, talk of concepts like ecological dynamics, the most resistance actually comes from these countries and coaches within these countries. And I think it's because, you know, exactly as you said, when you are winning, there's not necessarily a need to look over your shoulder and see what's coming next. And it's really funny because the first federations in Europe who have adopted this, so I worked with a bunch of the federations in Scandinavia to introduce the CLA in coach education, most notably Sweden. And they've got nothing to lose at the bottom. So they are trying. But I think it's really interesting because I would argue that it's actually just as important if you are a winner. If you really want to stay at the top, I think you have to see who's trying to knock you off that throne and obviously be attuned of all the developments that are happening in sport and skill acquisition. And I'd say we're certainly not seeing that right now in basketball.
You made me think in a Spanish quote that I liked a lot, which is, el momento de reparar el tejado es cuando el sol brilla, which is like,
the right moment to fix the roof is when the sun is shining.
Yes. And you've got, just a couple of days hanging out with you, Marty, you've got all these amazing metaphors and stories. And that's kind of my whole approach to everything I'm doing in basketball, trying to have very specific intentions and really systematic strategies in everything. Because if you're always playing catch up or you don't have a plan and you're not really organized, then you can't get ahead of these things when they come. So even in example of player development, right? Let's just take a very specific example. Instead of just working in a haphazard manner where you're planning things the night before the day of, well, can we actually think shorter, medium, longer term? What's the intention over the whole season for a player, multiple seasons? What's the next 3 weeks going to look like for them? And I think that's something that really stays with me in terms of I'm always trying to learn. I'm always trying to get new ideas despite, this irregardless of what's going on, whether things are well, whether things are going poorly. I think it's just trying to continuously be open to all the developments around us.
Yeah. Now, sorry, but you made me think about another quote of Leonardo da Vinci, Italian, which I like a lot, which he said, "He who loves practice without theory is like the sailor who boards ship without a rudder and compass and never knows where he might cast."
Yeah, and that's a fantastic quote just for the dominant approach. And I think that's kind of why we're in the conundrum that we're now in the sports world, especially the basketball world, but the sports world, because it's not just basketball, where there is a little bit of a clash, if I'm honest, between the dominant approach and contemporary approach, as I like to call it, in terms of CLA, supplemented by some doses of differential learning. And I think it's really interesting. We've spoken about it a lot here at the camp, the Transforming Summer Camp, where we've got 50 coaches from all over the world, really, who all believe in this. And the hardest things, the questions they're coming to us the most with is how can we kind of argue these points against very traditionally inclined coaches, or how can we get other coaches on the staff to really see this and believe it? And I think it all comes down to exactly what you said in the quote, and that's a theoretical framework. And I think you have to understand the framework of human movement. You have to understand how your players are actually moving and doing the things that they're doing on the court. And that's obviously where understanding constraints, understanding dynamical systems, ecological psychology, it's critical. Because if you don't understand that, well, how can you as an organization design optimal processes or conditions which allow the players to be successful? And obviously in coaching, how can you create practices that are optimal for learning if you're not getting to the bottom of these things? I'd say you can't.
I'm gonna transcribe these last sentences and print it out in every Spanish club. Because I personally look in my path. I've been coaching maybe around 10 years. But when I started to research about what learning was, what was teaching, how do we move, it wasn't that long time ago. So then I see the Martí that started, and it's like that. No, you were a sailor that you didn't know where you had to go.
That's it. And, that's how I started. And when I started coaching, I was very easily influenced by celebrity coaches, and I'd just watch their videos on YouTube and try and copy paste them with no clue as to why I was doing that. And it's funny because the biggest thing we hear now is that the CLA is just old wine in new bottles, and it's been done for years. And obviously it's completely not the case. But I think one of the reasons why coaches are saying that is because they don't have that theory, and they see a small-sided game here and there, and they think, oh, look, we've been doing that. And yes, let's take a country like Spain. Coaches have used small-sided games for 40 years, far longer than I've been alive. But they're not often with very clear intentions. They're not with a very specific language of principles of play. And critically, last two, they're not with very purposeful constraint manipulations, which are changing every time. So you often see the exact same small-sided game every time. And finally, this is the most notable difference, they're often done after you have to correct my pronunciation here, technification.
Yes.
You know, all the
perfect.
all the 1-on-0, the 2-on-0, and coaches will do that, and then they create the small-sided game. And even if they don't say to the athletes, I want you to do the moves that we just did in this session, that's essentially what they're saying by creating the small-sided game. They're basically saying, do all the moves that we just repped out. And obviously what we're saying with the CLA is we don't need any of that stuff. In fact, all that stuff is actually just reducing the players' chance of being successful in the game because it's completely unnecessary. We just need to get to the CLA immediately, be very efficient, be very specific, be very intentional, and then we're going to see a more optimal environment for skill adaptation to occur.
That's something that I think is really important. Like, as you said, not that you were copying successful coaches. I don't think that it's anything bad, but I think that the fact that we have to copy about a successful coach is not what he's doing the task, is what has happened in his mind in order to make that task. What's that criteria? Regarding what you were saying, I've been coaching using small-sided games, but let's say using small-sided games with a dominant approach way of thinking is not a constraint-led approach. So always go deeper, a bit more deeper.
Huge difference. Even just how you're focused on the like I remember when I probably used to use small-sided games, I had no clue what I was looking at. My thought process would be completely different. Like now I was speaking with a coach about it today, and it's like in every small-sided game now I can really see what's going on. Like I'm paying attention so specifically to the defensive coverage and the subtleties of their positioning, their deception, their verbal communication, their non-verbal communication. But then at the same time, I'm able to pay attention to the offense and how their posture, how they're interacting. And the only way that would have happened is if I'd had multiple years really using the CLA, because before when I do a small-sided game, I'd probably just look at one thing and I wouldn't have that ability to really be attuned to my environment as a coach and see what they were actually doing. And then critically think, what next? Like, how are they interacting? How are they behaving? What constraint or what piece of feedback needs to be used to more effectively kind of shape the education of intention within this activity?
So would you agree that being a CLA coach, an ecological dynamic coach, it's more about not the tasks you do, but how you look at the training?
For sure it is. It's a lens which you're using to view your sport, performance in your sport, and you're not just applying it to coaching, but ideally all the organizational fields. So your warm-ups, how you're using video in the weight room. So it's a 360-degree kind of outlook, which we're using within our sport, obviously basketball in this instance. And obviously the practice design is a huge part of that. And what I would say just practically for coaches is you have to start with that. That's how I started, just understanding how to do it on the court. And then I think the more comfortable you get with it, then the easier it is to start thinking how you roll it out in all the other areas.
Here, sorry, Alex. My dad is just writing me. He's live in the podcast and he wants you to explain to him what we say ecological dynamics or CLA, but has to understand my dad and not me.
I loved it, and I've heard this before on many of the previous Fosbury Flop episodes. Yeah. So I was ready for this one, Marty.
My dad is the person who is in every episode. He helps me a lot without being here. Thank you, Dad.
But this is great, and I think we have to have simpler terms and descriptions of things within now with this movement becoming more popular. So to answer the question, I would simply say an ecological approach, ecological dynamics, whatever you want to call it, creating very specific, very representative learning environments in practice where the players can adapt, make decisions, move freely without being micromanaged with every part of the movement, right? That's a very simple way of going about it. I actually use the word decisions just with coaches new to this for the first time because I think everyone aligns with that as opposed to talking about like affordances and things like that. And representative is an interesting word because for me, something like a 2-on-2 with the right constraints is highly representative. So I'm not saying 5-on-5. It's these small slices of the game, these very specific small-sided games with very creative constraints That's what I'm talking about.
I think it's a hard question, but would you be able to say the criteria of representativeness? Like, when is it representative, what not? What does it need to have in order to represent the game?
It's an interesting one because I put the representative dial in the book, but I think it could look slightly different for every person. And I think obviously you've got 5-on-5 on one end of the spectrum, and then you've probably got most of the drills we see in the basketball world today at the other end, 0, in terms of no representativeness, things like the my can drill, 2-ball dribbling, swat shooting. And I'd actually say, Marty, where I live mostly is probably between the 3 and the 6, where it's, okay, you've got maybe a 1 on the representative dial would be shooting, where you're changing spot every time, and maybe you have a defender just coming from a different place. And then the idea is obviously as you add more teammates, you're probably going to go up that representative dial. But it's not everything, of course. The coach asked me this at the camp, and they said that they saw that the real difference is how we use like 2-on-2s, 1-on-1 plus 1, 3-on-3. It's how we're constraining those activities. And I think I would honestly say to coaches, I don't think you really have to be concerned with the representative dial so much. I think what's more important is the rationale behind why you're choosing an activity, how you designed it, the constraints within it, and how you're ready to respond based on what happens within it. And then naturally, if you're doing that, I think you're going to find that you're fluctuating. You know, in my practices, I might start very representative 5-on-5. I might see a very specific rate limiter, such as our pick and roll switching. Maybe it's really poor and we're having very passive switches. We're not trying to create collisions. We're giving up rejects. So we might now scale it back to a 2-on-2, or maybe even a 1-on-1 plus. I don't know. There's loads of different things we could do. Solve the rate limiter, give them reps. And then maybe we go 3-on-3 with the same problem, pick and roll switching. Maybe then we go 5-on-5 and we see if it sticks. So this is where I think it's combining the empirical foundation of CLA with your gut instinct. And this is what Sergio Oliva, obviously someone we both really admire, he spoke about that in the book, where it's always going to be feel and science. And this is why coaches are, I can't give a coach my whole recipe and they're immediately going to do it. It's not the way it works. It's going to take, how I learned this was years and years and years of application, and that gut instinct of this is what the players need next. And you just can't create a recipe for that, if that makes sense.
I think the recipe is not, like the recipe one has to sell or provide is not what task he does, but what principles.
That's it. What tools and principles they're using in their practices. Exactly.
So what's the problem, for example, with the shell drill?
Great question. So shell drill, just for context, maybe I'll quickly explain it for the non-basketball coaches. So it's probably the most popular drill in the NBA and all professional leagues across the world, college too, where you'll typically have 4 or 5 passive opponents who aren't real opponents on offense, and then you have the players on defense. And what typically happens is the coach shows them a pattern that the offense are going to run. So the defense have the problem, and then they basically rep it out where they solve the problem that they know what's coming. So using the Juan Cortez quote, which I include in the book because it was a great quote, and it was, in any activity where the players know what the answer is before they do it, it's a good activity for synchronized swimming and not for basketball. And it's so true. And that to me is the shell drill. And I think it's really interesting because especially in the NBA, it's kind of what all the players know, what they're familiar with. So it's challenging because if we try and do, like in a great perfect world, I literally just have coaches on offense playing variably every single time. And it's just live with different constraints. But I think what we need to understand is there's a spectrum of what's acceptable to the players, right? And it's like, can we maybe take a shell drill and we just add a few constraints and it stops becoming a drill and it becomes the shell game, where instead of saying this is the problem, this is what I want you to solve, the coaches have 3 actions that they're running in a very random and unpredictable order. And sometimes maybe they disguise the action. So say we've got something like a stack, which is a Spain pick and roll. We've got a stack. We've got a wide, which is an off the ball screen. And then maybe we've got a pick and roll on the side. So maybe they're disguising these actions before they get into it. But the main thing is these three main actions. And we're trying to see if the defense can contain them. And the thing is, we're not trying to have perfect defense, because perfect is not good for game performance. What we're trying to do is actually make the players mistake to make a mistake.
What you said about this perfection, it's about representativeness, no?
That's it.
I think Jaime Sampaio in Mataró, in a Congress, made these points, no? That you were looking for continuously finish the training when you have a high percentage of threes, but the way you assume to achieve those high percentages are completely opposite to what you will find in the game.
That's it, Marty. And, you know, continuing with that example in the shell drill, what you'd often see, and this is just my example last year when I was going against these guys who I could never stay in front of, right? But they're defending me. And obviously it's not representative, because I might be dribbling off a pick and roll and I could just steal the ball immediately. But the body position that they use to steal the ball, well, against another NBA player, they're just going to reject, and it's going to be an advantage. So this is the problem. You're actually encouraging movements and behaviors that are not conducive for performance when you're doing this. So then you've got to think about how you could change the constraints within that. So maybe, for instance, you're saying, all right, you can't strip the coaches when they're dribbling. Obviously, having coaches who can play is a key advantage, but then you can constrain it more. So you can say it's only in terms of you can only steal it when it's a paint touch or on the rebound. And you're changing the spacings, the positions every time. Maybe you're doing a transition trip. So you're not just always on defense, but maybe you're transitioning. You're trying to protect in an outnumbered scenario. Then everyone else gets back. Now you're trying to defend the sequences. And by doing that, really, it very quickly doesn't become a shell drill. But the players don't know that, right? And that's the thing. They don't know that, and they don't need to know that, because they understand why we're doing it, because it's so specific. And so a lot of people have asked me, what do we think about high-level players and them being explained the CLA? And well, they don't need to know, because what happens is they see why their players are smart, and they see the specificity of these activities. And most of the time, they're going to understand that these things are helping them more than something that's really boring and really passive, like a traditional shell.
Yeah, you made me think on one anecdote with a paddle coach, that in one training, he was a coach and player. And one training, he was instructing all the time, but based on body positions, not the elbow, not the hand. And in the halftime, I went and I said, hey, guy, one question. When you play, what do you think? And he told me, no way. I don't think. If I think, I miss. So I thought about that with the shell, no? You manage the focus of attention of the player, and it's completely different about the game. So it's not playing the game anymore. It's you're playing your game, your exercise.
That's it. And I think it's really interesting, because everyone does the shell, especially at the highest levels, just because every team does it. And like you said, it's often, if you were to go team to team, Marty, you would probably see the exact same variations of the shell being done, even with patterns like closeouts and things which never happen in basketball. And this is why I think it's just, as coaches, we have to start thinking without even needing to understand CLA and skill acquisition. We have to start thinking, is this activity, does it actually work on something that's going to relate to increasing their performance in the game? And what is the actual intention behind this activity? Because if the intention of a shell drill is to improve our defensive rotations or closeouts, well, we're not doing that when they know exactly what's coming next, right? And I think as coaches, we just have to keep asking that question, does this make sense? And if it doesn't make sense, then stop doing it and think of something else you could do. Don't just continue to do something because it's the way a whole league has done something for 50 years. That's never been a recipe for success. I think soccer is still really far behind, but I think it's a lot further ahead than basketball. Why? I think the personalities of some European managers, there's more risk-taking in certain areas. I think tactically there's a lot of control, but what you will see in practice is typically far more small-sided games than basketball. I think the reason why is just managers in soccer are a little bit more willing to experiment, try, and obviously this gets a little bit into differences between Europe, North America, forms of life, etc.
But coming back to the CLA and ecological dynamics, so seeing you so convinced about, could you say that any coach who doesn't follow this way of doing is coaching wrongly?
I don't want to use the word wrong because I think it's too strong. And obviously we got to remember there have been legendary coaches who have no clue who CLA is, but maybe they're still really good coaches, right? And I think the best example is nowadays in the NBA or NCAA or any pro league, there's so much that goes into coaching. And I think that the practice design is a huge part of it, but it's not the only part. And I think you could still be a highly effective coach at those levels without a knowledge of CLA if you're really good in other areas. And then maybe you're empowering a staff member on your staff who specializes in this to be more involved in practice design and things. But again, forms of life, it's not often seen that way. So to traditionally what we believe is that a head coach has to know everything. And I think that's really impossible, especially with the stresses of basketball in the present day. So I think the smart organizations would have no silos, but having experts who are responsible for practice design, implementing scouts, video, so it's all aligned through a contemporary lens. And I'd also say this, I think a lot of great coaches have unintentionally used CLA principles, but it's not the CLA. But I think as soon as the theory is described to them and they actually get the chance to sit down and learn about it, it makes them even more intentional of why certain things they've done in the past have been effective and how they can do more of those things as opposed to some of the dominant approach stuff. And just what I would say is, look, I think I'm probably one of the biggest advocates for CLA out there in any sport, just because I've seen it, lived it, done it for 5 years now, and I've seen what it can do. But I think, yes, compared to the dominant approach, there's no doubt in my mind that it's far superior. But I think at the same time, I'm just cognizant of coaches who maybe haven't received the opportunity to be exposed to CLA. And I think everyone's at a different journey. And now I'm a lot more non-judgmental than I was when I started, when I was very brash, very kind of it's this way or it's not. Now I'm a lot more meeting people where they're at, trying to see the best in everyone. And for some people, maybe their journey with the CLA is going to come in the next month. For some people, 6 months. For some people, a year. For some people, maybe never. But I still think there's value that every coach on a staff can provide.
And do you think that it will be a next stage after the CLA? I mean, no, we were coaching according to information processing. Is CLA here forever? What do you I know it's a tricky question.
I think skill acquisition, I'm hoping, is always evolving. And I think what I'm hoping the research will go towards is having more specific research versus theoretical papers. And I think some of those theoretical papers have really helped me. But I think now we need to produce more specific research with this, and it's difficult because doing compare-contrast studies, of course, it's challenging. But I think what we've got to look at is particular, very specific parts of the game where we could look at the CLA versus dominant approach. And then I think the findings from that could inform where we go next. And I think for me, the next frontier is, I believe it's going to take many years, if ever, for pro coaches to catch up with this. Just the nature, it's just the way things are, what we're dealing with. But I think the organizations who do it, as soon as they have success, everyone else will copy. But you've got to, it's not just the coaching. The reason why it's so valuable, this stuff, is because it's, like I mentioned, it applies to every field, performance, physio, and it's so challenging to do that because the number of people
inside and outside of the court.
That's it. And exactly. So when you think about it, Marty, like the number of people in the world who can do this in basketball, it's literally on the finger of one hand. So it's why I imagine, you hire all these people in one place, or you have a ridiculous advantage because everyone else is always going to be playing catch up to you. So that's kind of how I feel about it. And I think people, the interesting thing too is if you're already in a professional league, it's actually very challenging to do this because of the constraints of the system. You almost have to take a step back and maybe coach somewhere else or find a way to get lots of reps on the job, because it's those reps that makes you a better coach and allows you to learn CLA. And I can say this, like, equivocally, I would not be the person, the coach I am today without the years I had coaching all levels of basketball, from beginners in Sweden who couldn't dribble a ball to Paris basketball, assisting there, to college prep, under 19s to under 12s. Like, it's all the levels of basketball that I've worked with, and especially the lower levels, that allow me to experiment, become so comfortable and confident as a coach. And if I was just starting the pros, like, I would never have received those opportunities.
It's the what we were saying, that we can apply it to everything. The same way that we see the behavior of the player of the team in accordance to the environment they are in, the coach is also in a, let's say, league environment, national environment, that also constrains a lot. So it might be hard, no? Maybe if you are a top coach to go against the current. And
that's it. It takes someone very innovative and brave to the highest level to go all in with it. But for me, it just makes complete sense, because it's the competitive advantage you need to access. If you're, let's be honest, like, if you're not in the top 4 teams in any professional league, you have to do something very different if you want to win. So why would you not do this?
I agree. After reading the chapters of your book, the first chapters, I wanted to ask you, in which you are quite hard on the dominant approach, and I don't think it's wrong, but I wanted to ask you if you have something about CLA that you don't like and something that you would highlight from the dominant approach. Hey, they have done all of this and it has been nice,
Yeah, great question. So I think the terminology is a barrier. I think it's, if a coach is exposed to this and today they start reading about this and they come across ecological dynamics, nonlinear pedagogy, CLA, all these words, it can be a hindrance. Now, it's the best of both, because words like an affordance, we need it because there's no other, word in the dictionary for it. But I think there is a bit of an unnecessary overlap in some areas. And I think just making more sense of that, like, for instance, this, nonlinear pedagogy and CLA, I think it should just be one. It doesn't make sense, I don't believe, to have both. It just starts confusing coaches. So that's one thing. I think there's also it also gets a little confusing for coaches now with things like differential learning, CLA, what is DL, what is CLA, and even the researchers are at odds with each other in both fields. But I think when it comes to the donut approach too, I do think it's interesting, because I think there's some good work that's been done there that we can just bring over to a contemporary approach. So for instance, we'll look at external versus internal of Wolf's work. That's obviously a key part of nonlinear pedagogy. So it makes complete sense with a CLA. I think something like optimal challenge point from Gradinoli and Lee is great. And that's actually something I use a lot with coaches, because it's really practical. It's just talking about, all right, how can you create optimal challenge in your activity where they're not making every shot and they're missing like 1 in 3 reps? Well, naturally, how do you do that? You start using constraints, start playing defense. So I don't think it's a case of throwing everything out, but taking some things, and that's kind of the way I view CLA, Marty. It's trying to meet coaches where they're at, and maybe they do an activity through a traditional lens, which could easily be CLA with 1 or 2 tweaks. And that's how I try and meet them where they're at, bring them over to CLA, and really start being more intentional with using it.
And with a CLA constraint-led approach, how would you say that is the main task of the coach? First,
yeah.
Go on.
Okay. So I'd say really, you got to have an intention for every small-sided game. What's an intention? Why are you doing this small-sided game? And if you don't know, it's probably not a good small-sided game, right? So for me, I design small-sided games really based on two things. It's principles of play and rate limiters. And it's a confluence of both, which impacts how I design the small-sided games with the constraints. And obviously, it's not a case of explaining the small-sided game and then leaving it and letting anything happen. It's almost a frenetic pace of manipulating constraints in the practice where every 2 minutes I might slightly change it, or maybe I change it in a big way. It depends. So kind of the role is, Keith Davids has spoken about this, you're kind of an architect of an environment as opposed to an instructor. So you're not telling them how to finish, what technique to do, how to specifically do the move. You're explaining the constraints, explaining the small-sided game, leaving gaps, as Craig Morris said, and then you can fill in the gaps later if you need to. So what I often say to coaches is try and describe the activity in the least amount of time needed. And that's a sign of great coaching. And what we often see in the NBA is practice becomes a coaching clinic, and coaches are trying to speak, get their voice across to be heard. I think that emerges because of how many people there are on the staff. So when they get an opportunity, it's often a rarity. So then they feel like they have to give more so that people are listening to them, right? Whereas my approach is the opposite. It's how can I get the players to do what we need to do with the fewest words possible? Because now we've got more time for learning to occur. We've got more time for the players to really explore this activity. And guess what? Well, now because of that, because we've saved so much time in the practice, we can actually do more. We can get through more. We can be more prepared for the next game.
I was really grateful that in one of the first lessons I think I had with Joan Cortez, he suggested to control the useful motor time of the training. So use the clock in order to see how much they were stopped. You were talking, they were practicing. And this was at the beginning of my path as a coach, and I will be grateful to it all my life.
Yeah, I'd be fascinated just if you looked at the average. I call that time on task. I think that's such a good idea. If you looked at the average time on task from a shoot around or a practice at the highest level, I think it would be pretty shocking what you'd see. And I think it's what we often see is even things like the players all down one end. And it makes zero sense pedagogically because players will often get one rep every 90 seconds, if that. So it's just an awareness of these things it's so important.
You have mentioned the principles of play or the rate limiters. My dad has been watching my brother and me during all our sport life playing basketball, and he's used to closed sets and so on. So it's your turn that he discovers principles of play and rate limiters.
So I'd say principles of play, they're a northern star to give the players very specific intentions in each phase of the game. Transition offense, half-court offense, transition defense, half-court defense. So what we often see, Marty, is players often just, I want to use the word hooping, right, without intentions. So they're literally just going into random triggers, random actions, and they're not attuned to defensive coverages, what the opponent is doing, how their teammates are moving. Or we have something that's so strict, so imposed, like we see in a lot of set plays in Europe, where coaches insist that players run these sets to the end of the set, that they become so focused on the pattern that they miss out on these advantage creating opportunities that could be there in early parts. So a principles of play approach is something like a conceptual offense, which is very common in the NBA, but my version is extremely different, where instead of running all these random triggers, we're focused on really just a few triggers executed to an extreme, relentless level of efficiency, where we're focusing on coverage solutions in everything we do, having known spacings from everything we play out of. And we're literally just going to do that. We're not going to do any random dribble handoffs, delays. It's going to be very intentional. We're going to choose what players we want in the action, what opponents we want. And we are going to talk as a team and have a shared understanding of some of the attractive affordances that appear out of these triggers. And that's just a coverage solution in basketball. So, yeah.
Who decides these principles? It's you the one who imposes them?
So I think it's a combination. And I think it depends on who you're coaching, context, all of this. Forms of life. That's a big thing. You can't you can't copy paste principles of play. And this is my biggest annoyance for maybe European soccer, where coaches take the exact same game models to each club. And of course, some of them have a lot of success with that. But I believe you have to be adapting based on the players you have. So for me, principles of play would be designed based on the most important thing, which is your players. And I would actually ask some of the key players on your team, the stars, okay, what coverage solutions do you like the most? How do you like to play against the drop? How can we put you in a position to be successful? Or maybe the numbers show this. So are you cool if we do your pick and roll efficiency in the middle third with player X is sky high? So how do you feel about ramping this up, Marty? And we'll do more of this and less of this stuff. So I think you have to involve the players. And I don't think players are used to being asked that question. So having the very specific conversations. Then I think you have to look at opponents. So say you're preparing for playoffs and maybe there's a particular opponent that you know you're going to come across. Well, what's something we could do that maybe might hurt us a little bit in the regular season, but not enough where it impacts our standings considerably, but it's going to give us a big advantage in the playoffs against this opponent. Okay, that's a principle of play we're going to look at. And I'm a big believer in principles of play, which are a little bit unique. So I spoke about this with JD Dubois, one of the coaches visiting the camp. He coached with the Lakers as an assistant the last 2 years. And we're talking about all the things I would love to try one day in a professional setting, which other teams do not do. But because it's different, can't prepare for it.
Can you say some of them? Sorry.
Sure, absolutely. So the actual example we were talking about was KYP coverages. So we're working on allowing the players to choose the level of the drop based on who they were and who they were guarding, and mixing it up based on the pick and roll partnership of who they're playing with and against, right? As opposed to just saying there's one coverage, we're going to do it the same every time. And the other example was the peel switch. So instead of putting two on the ball, like we see in all pro basketball, we basically peel switch and it's one rotation, done. So we're not giving up advantages when they pass out of the trap the box because we're there. Great example. Now, because peel switching is so unique and no other teams do that, when you play against teams, they're not going to have time to prepare. And coaches we're talking about how you'd punish it, and how I would punish a peel switch is probably a very intentional 45 cut, or maybe a cut and slide where we actually cut the corner and drift the 45. But coaches may have that answer, but then they don't have the tools because of skill acquisition to actually implement that with players in season to punish it in the game. And that's knowledge of versus knowledge about. And
it's important to know you can see an answer, but the way of teaching it and implementing it is not ordinary.
That's what I mean. So coaches, there's a lot of really smart coaches at the highest level. So of course, many of them will pick up on that. But then what will often happen is that message will be disguised because of how video is done in the professional level. There's no intention to video. People are often watching video for 40 minutes with their players showing random clips. So what will happen is that really important message might be mixed in with 20 other bits of information. Or pre-game, that really important specific key is mixed in with white noise, like play fast, finish possessions, which means nothing. So what happens? Well, amidst all this noise, the players don't pay attention to the most important information. Sure enough, the likelihood of the players executing that decreases.
Actually, regarding the video analysis, Luis Enrique, the coach of Paris Saint-Germain, always said that his assistant coach, Raphael Paul, said the following quote of Blaise Pascal, which said, "If I would have more time, I would have written you a shorter letter saying, hey, just say the least amount of information that can impact the most."
That's it. And I think it takes a very confident coach to do that. And I can do that because I know the impact it's having on my players. And I will avoid at all costs giving them superfluous information, which means nothing. I will never say to a player, play fast, finish possessions, take care of the basketball. It's a waste of my breath. And I don't mean that to be rude, but we have to be far more specific, right? I might say to, okay, the intention this game is we are really going to focus on popping more against their drop coverage. So cutting the pop is going to be very important. That's going to be one key. And we're going to, every time out, we're going to talk about it. Subs, we're going to talk about it.
For example, here, Alex, aren't you observing maybe a proper solution, but then you are being very linearly trying to look for it?
So I'd say it's really an art, and this happens the more the players are used to working with you, the easier it becomes. So what I mean by that is when I had my own team, the last time I was head coaching a team would have been college prep in Italy. So at the very start of the year, I always said to them in a timeout, if I say something like, all right, let's look for a cut the pop. I'm saying look for a cut the pop. I'm not saying let's do it every time. If we're playing against switching, I'm not saying do a relay pass ahead every time. I'm not saying flip the pick every time. Maybe we might flip the pick for the next 3 possessions, see what happens, do something very specific. The key word for is look for. So what I'm doing is I'm directing their search within the affordance landscape to my knowledge about as a coach, something I've identified through my knowledge of the game that is going to be an effective solution. But they must know that we can't do that thing every time, because even if a team is always switching, the switch is going to be different every time. Sometimes it might be a passive switch. Sometimes it might be aggressive. We're going to be in a slightly different position every time. So I'd rather that they have flexibility in coverage solutions, but still have very clear predefined coverage solutions while still searching for one or two that might be advantageous for that opponent. But knowing that if something else appears, they have the green light because I trust them that they're making a decision based on what they think is optimal for that moment. Because so it's a fine line.
I was thinking I completely agree with the principles of play that you propose. Maybe now you could tell us a little bit the ones you used in the last of your experience as a head coach. But at the same time, I really agree. I was thinking, Marty, if you could do it, you have to be really careful to not make these principles the knowledge of about that we.
That's it. That's
the knowledge
exactly
about
it.
that we criticize so much.
Often what I do is I constrain it at the start, and then once they start becoming aware of what's possible, now we're expanding. And I always also leave time for the players to express their creativity with some coverage solutions. And I think too, you can't be too, especially depending on who you're coaching and where you're coaching. Like, let's take the NBA. You can't just say to a player, we are only doing these 2 things against the switch. It's just not going to work like that. You've got to co-design it with them and come at it together. And you can definitely present attractive options, things that we know are effective for the players we have. But maybe you do using 80 to 90% of the time, but there's still a little bit of space for the players who are obviously so brilliant that level to show what they're doing. And the key thing here, Marty, too, is we're talking about the principle, not the movement. So this is very important, because let's take a reject, right? Well, a player is going to express themselves in the reject differently every time. I'm never going to tell them how to reject. So what works for one player is going to be very different for another, but we're going to have that principle of a reject very important as a coverage solution against an aggressive coverage. But I'm never going to get into the minutiae of how they should supposedly rep out the technique or do it.
So I guess that the principles of play, for example, one that I really like about your book was that one defensive player cannot guard 2.
Exactly, part of dominoes. Yeah.
But the way of working it is seeing it as a consequence, no? So I propose a task in which, in order to have success, this thing will have to emerge. Or
Correct.
Am I wrong?
Nope, that's exactly it. And what I often do too, Marty, is I create the constraints, and the players naturally do these principles anyway with the constraints. And then all we do is we attach a name to the things they do. And that to me is important, because it's how you get buy-in from the players. And I think, I'm very honest. I didn't play the game, right? I wasn't a high-level player. But I feel like I have a really good relationship with my players at all levels because of how I'm giving them autonomy. But then it's such a level of specificity, while they have this level of autonomy within actually something that's quite structured, but it's actually the structure that allows them to be more creative. Because what happens in other settings is it's so random that real spontaneous creativity can't emerge so much, because it's almost every possession so surprising, right? So it's I might create like a 2-on-2 wall pick and roll in condensed space. We'll have a short shot clock. and the solutions that emerge within a particular coverage, then I'll be like, all right, that was a great reject. That was a great pocket. That was a great ghost screen. That was a great slip. And now the players start attaching that language to some of the solutions that they're exploiting. And it's not a case of me necessarily. Now, some of them I might have to show, but it's more coming from them.
But it's a way of making the big amount of variability functional.
Correct.
If there is too much. At the same time, I was making you the last question about the pursuing the consequence so the principle will emerge. I was thinking, yeah, but then Mark, if you do this, you are pursuing what maybe a dominant approach coach might do, that is look for his answers. So do you think that with a constraint-led approach or ecological dynamics, there is room for direct orders?
For sure there is.
Direct solutions?
Certainly. I think the difference, though, is we're talking more about, like today, right? We were scripting the pop every time against a drop, but still so many situations could emerge, right? So we were doing out of gets and pick and rolls. We started where a player would come off and the player could pop, but maybe the driver would score. Maybe they'd pass back in a different way every time, okay? Maybe the pass would go to the pop and they would shoot. Maybe they would drive either way. Maybe they would drive and finish. Maybe they would drive and kick pass. So even though we were constraining that, we weren't ever talking about how to do it.
It's how do you use it,
right? We weren't talking about the specific movement. It was the outcome. It was the principle of play. So what I often say is there's room for direct instruction on principles of play, but I leave the movement alone. And if a player is like, let's say a player is finding it difficult, Marty, to finish against the help defender, the low man, the MIG, whatever you want to call it, I might say, all right, can you find a different way to finish against the low? Can you find a way to avoid them? Could you finish through them? Could you finish around them? I'm not saying put your elbow here, put the ball here. I'm using the constraints to do the talking.
As always, is what, no, and why you do it, no? With the discussion in the morning, I love aphorisms. And you made me think in the quote that, do you over-constrain to make them reach your destination or to force them to discover new landscapes?
And I'd say we're over-constraining in short doses to hasten the search within the affordance landscape. That's what it's doing. Because if we didn't have something so specific, they would never be able to actually see a particular affordance or have the opportunity to find functional ways to act on it. So that's why it was so specific. The practice we had this morning, we were doing the drop stuff. Then we said, all right, you can only pass once you get the paint touch. Because what started happening was they were very passively making the throwback and they hadn't fixated the drop defender. I see that a lot in the NBA. So naturally, there was no advantage on the closeout. So then we said, you got to get a paint touch before you make the throwback. So now that changed everything. Then we started lating the pop where it would be the verbal to switch it or to stay. And we were constraining that, but it was, there's different coming from different angles, different players in the action. And then obviously it was more variable where we had the different levels of drop. They could roll all pop, mix it up. So they didn't know that the pop was going to come every time. Then it was a pick and roll or get. So it's basically making affordances appear less and less. Once you over constrain to start with, you're tuning into something very specific, which is what we did. But then the affordance that I wanted them to attune to was playing off the pop on offense, and it became less.
Why you over constrain? So they make the close-end pattern, which in your mind you think it's perfect, or you over-constrain to force them to maybe discover a new affordance?
That's exactly it.
At the same time that I was asking you about these direct instructions, in which I completely agree, no? Because our goal is to be more efficient as a team. So that means you have to use they have to be evidence-based tools, but there is a big landscape. So I wanted to ask you the same about analytical. There is room for on-air drills, analytical drills. I haven't seen any of them in the camp.
In my opinion, I just don't think there's a need. And I don't want to necessarily say drills we don't use the word drill. We call it activity, right? But look, if you've got a group of NBA players and that's what they want to do, great, fine. But try and find little ways you can change it. But I just don't think using drills is going to help you create environments to win games at the highest level. And I'm obsessed with competing, and I'm pretty obsessed with creating environments that help players become the best versions of themselves and win games. And to me, when I'm in a practice and we're using drills, I get frustrated because I know of how much better the alternative is, the CLA. And it's more, the reason I get frustrated is because I know what we could be doing. And I know that we could be helping them learn faster. And I know that we could be helping them perform at a higher level. It's going to win us more games. And that's why I'm so passionate about this, because I don't want to do anything that doesn't put my team in a better position to win. So
that's the goal of coaching.
That's the goal of coaching, right? So I honestly believe that when you're doing these traditional drills, you're really shooting yourself in the foot, because you're not creating the specific problems that the players need to be encountering to be making them better. And I think, obviously, especially at the highest level, is much less practice time, but you can still be so creative. And the thing is, it means that every second counts. So if let's say you just drafted a rookie, right? And you're in a practice and you spend 15 minutes spot shooting, doing form shooting. That's an enormous amount of time just completely wasted. That's probably making the player worse, that could have been poured into something else.
But here, Alex, when I think on no drills, I think a lot on just passing and shooting.
Okay.
For example, if the why of do that, it's because you as a coach think that will develop the team, I think it's wrong, no? But have you found situations in, for example, the why is the confidence of the player, just his own routine?
So people say this,
and he's obsessed.
Exactly. So I think routine is a big thing in the pros, and players will have routines. And the thing is, naturally what happens is they equate their success to the routines, but it was all the other things that made them successful, right? And I honestly believe it's false confidence, because you maybe get confidence from the routine, but it's not going to transfer to the game. Because let's take an example. You're in the playoffs. We use the example of pick and pop, right? We use that example because we're talking about it. And in your routine, you do pick and pop shooting every time. It's like all you do. But then you're in game 7 of the playoffs, and you pick and pop, and it's a tied game, and it's the last 2 minutes. Well, think about all the constraints that are impacting you in that specific moment. Think about the pressure and the confidence to take that shot. Well, guess what? I know a lot of players who maybe would turn down particular shots that they've repped loads in their routines because the game is completely different. So imagine if they've actually taken that shot in a more representative setting, where they've done it against some type of guided or live defender, where they haven't made it 80% of the time, but maybe 50% of the time. Well, maybe then that gives them the confidence to actually take that shot in the game, because they've known that they've solved that problem in practice so many times, versus having that second doubt because they've never seen that situation in the practice environment, which is most professional players.
You made me think in maybe it's a problem of beliefs, no? But at least what I see in coaching and players, many of them still believe that the cause of performance, if the repetition after repetition of a perfect pattern. So we would be able to address that and think the goal to the most successful is that the one who adapts better. So maybe the routine wouldn't be to perform that technique, but to prepare for the adaptability in the game.
That's correct. That's exactly it. And even like we said, even a situation like a pick and pop, even if you script it live where it's a pick and pop throwback, well, still how you close out every time is going to be different, right? Where you receive the ball is going to be different if you're doing it live. This time in which you have to release it is going to be different. So there's still so much more variability we can get in a very specific scenario.
I love the ideas, the mindset, whatever is behind what you do. But Alex, looking back, with which episodes or with which people or whatever, if they wouldn't have been there, you couldn't have reached this way of thinking, this philosophy?
Great question. So I think I'm really obviously grateful to the researchers who actually outlined an ecological approach CLA, because it was their work that allowed me to realize that no one was doing this in basketball yet. And that inspired me to pioneer this in the basketball world. So I think the people who really in particular inspired me were obviously Keith Davids. And I got the chance to meet Keith a couple times this year, and it was, incredible. Just, he's obviously a prolific individual in the field. Rob Gray, his work was very accessible. And that when I first came across it about 5 years ago, it really helped me study it. Stuart Armstrong was also big, just his work in coach education, obviously also from the UK. A lot of his podcasts made me think very deeply upon what this was. And I'd say a lot of conversations, like friends like Adam Omachinsky, who now obviously works for me at Transforming, who's here at the camp. And it was just so many conversations with Adam. He comes to all my practices that I'm doing here at the camp and just tells me, what have you thought about this? Or that constraint didn't work. Or we're just bouncing ideas off each other the whole time. And I think you have to have someone like that as a friend if you're a serious coach wanting to do this. Someone who's as invested in you and learning this, who can give you feedback, give you checks. And I think I'm just trying to get even from all the coaches here, I'm trying to get feedback. Like, what do you think? What can we do better here? So those are just some individuals early on in terms of how I first discovered CLA in regard to that. And then I think a second part to that would be practical application in terms of providing me with opportunities to actually harness the knowledge that I developed through all of these ideas. And I'd say two individuals in particular there would be Sergio Oliva and Will Weaver in an NBA setting. They really opened a lot of doors for me and really inspired me to think deeply about how this could work at the highest levels. And obviously there was a lot of just so many conversations with them, so much I've learned that I've incorporated into my coaching. And I think too, Marty, it's just always having that openness, that willingness to innovate, to learn, that I'd say the obsession with being ahead of everyone else. I'm completely obsessed with that. And finding other people who kind of are so aligned with that. It's obviously such a cool feeling because you're always wanting to stay ahead of the curve. And it's just a really difficult feeling to explain, but those two individuals helped me a lot in that area.
What do you think when you see the Alex before constraint-led approach?
So I think the one thing, Marty, is I always genuinely cared about the players and giving them a great experience. And that just from even when I was 15 coaching and I knew nothing, I had the positive intentions of that at heart. So things like using names for the players, getting to know them outside basketball, ensuring that they enjoyed coming to practice. And it sounds so simple, but even at the highest level, that doesn't happen sometimes, right? And I think I've always tried to be a transformational coach as opposed to transactional. And I view my role as a coach to empower others, to empower players, to empower staff. I've never viewed it as a position of power where I'm just going to be this dictator, tell everyone what to do. For me, it's not why I coach. It's not what coaching should be about. And it actually quite saddens me when I see how often this occurs in sports where we see such transactional leadership. So I'd say I had the best intentions of my players at heart, but I really had no clue how to coach. But I wanted to learn. I was pretty obsessed with learning. And I remember I was like 14 years old watching FIBA coaching clinic videos of, it was all the drills, but at the time I didn't know better. But I think that mindset helped me because I watched like hundreds of coaching clinics over the years. And that's probably what got me to the point of realizing that there needed to be something else at a sooner date. And then it was like the knowledge of all those things that I developed within those clinics. When I started learning about CLA, it was easier maybe to convert that into what I do now because I had that prior existing knowledge base.
Thanks to Craig Morris and Albert Batalla, I changed where it was like in my life to be wrong where we could call a failure or have bad beliefs. No, because all the work that you do, I remember summers closet in my room, just preparing the season, just learning more. And maybe with a point of view, trying to decipher motor skills, that it was wrong, but that helped me a lot.
Yeah.
And you have to go through that.
You have to. It's essential. And, I remember struggling with a lot of the motor learning skill literature at the beginning. But I think I was always quite persistent just to see it through. And even now, Marty, I see there are some books, I was talking about this with Adam the other day, like Dexterity and Development of Nikolai Bernstein. I'll be honest with you that I probably can't read that book. But it's like, I'm cool with that. And I know I don't necessarily need to, because I'm sure there's some great stuff I'd pick up. But for me, I've always hung my hat on the practical application. And yes, I want to know the theory, and the theory is important. But the thing that I'm really selling myself on is I'm a coach. At the end of the day, I'm not a researcher, and I want to show people how you coach with these ideas versus,
This is what Jordi Fernandez, not the one from NBA, but the one from Venezia Football Club.
I follow them. Great stuff.
Told me like, regarding the complex systems approach, like, we have been doing it so wrong that we have had to create a new theory in order to have the common sense back.
That's a great way of phrasing it. Path dependency, essentially.
And do you think that in your path, the fact of having been a high-level player, or maybe didn't start very early, or being able that you didn't have too many coaches, was an advantage or something that played against you?
Huge advantage.
Why?
I had no coaching role models growing up. It was me, and I was trying to head coach every level. Even when I did college prep, instead of being like an assistant coach in a pro league in Europe, I did prep when I had opportunities to be an assistant coach because I wanted to head coach and get reps. And I think if I had role model, it's why basketball coaching is 50 years behind, because we have this continuous cycle where how we start coaching is based on what we did as players or what we see from the first coaches who mentor us. And obviously, because the huge majority of coaches will use the dominant approach, that's all new coaches see. So then naturally they start doing the same thing. It's called the custodial approach in education. It's the same in sports coaching. So because I didn't have any of that, because I grew up in England, I wasn't negatively biased by these things. Because in England, I had opportunities to head coach from 15 years old. Well, guess what? If I grew up in Lithuania and Serbia in the US, you could absolutely bet that wouldn't have happened, right? I would have had to have been compliant. I would have had to learn from a much older mentor. And it's a good example of that is here in Italy. It's one of my favorite countries in the world, but it's incredibly hierarchical when it comes to coaching. And a lot of great young coaches who are brilliant minds who are restricted by much older coaches who believe it's like the rites of passage where they've got to do as they tell them, do as they say. And all these younger coaches, like we've got 6 of them who have come to the camp, have spent so much time learning about CLA and educating themselves, but they can't do it because of what the senior people in their clubs are telling them.
I completely agree.
And how I obviously overcame all of that was basically saying, all right, I'm not going to put myself in this situation. I'm not going to be constrained by the system of basketball. I'm going to blaze my own path, do my own thing. And when the time is right, then someone somewhere will notice that and give me a chance. And luckily that's what happened, obviously, with Sergi and, getting the chance with the G League team in Portland.
This is what Ferran Adrià, the best chef in the world, said, no, that he was a guy that changed the paradigm of cuisine without having it as a vocation and without having a master. But he said, if I would have a master, I wouldn't have been able to change it because I would have followed his steps. And I see in what you say 2 very positive things. That is, for example, in myself, I see how much it changed my development as a coach with basketball, a sport that I played for many years, and how it has been in paddle. But at the same time, I thought in you, many times I had to coach players that were much older than myself.
I was the
So
same.
the fact
Yeah.
that I don't know if it's like you, the fact of being from England or not having been a professional player, then you don't have a reputation, a brand that you have to earn. And while that one, the former basketball player, can be in the sofa because he has been, I had to be reading in the computer, researching, making courses.
Yeah, I definitely resonate with that. I mean, I remember I was coaching like 19-year-olds at 16, and same thing in a pro setting. When I first started there, I was coaching guys who were same age, older, sometimes much older than me. But again, it's like you have that in the back of your mind, and it just motivates you to work so hard and to accumulate the crispness of your delivery, like how you interact with the play, how you deliver a segment of practice. You know that it has to be so good so that no one questions you. And that, that's, I think, it's a positive constraint for that reason.
Maybe if you double the age, you start with the confidence already. But no, that's a constraint. The fact of having that constraint promotes some self-organization that can be very beautiful.
Yeah.
Alex, let's go to the Fosbury questionnaire to know your personality as a coach and as a person. Feel free to answer shorter or longer, to think it more or less. Why do you coach?
To allow players to fulfill their complete potential.
A talent you have as a coach?
I'd say awareness. And I'm not just saying of what's going on in the court, but I like to think I'm socially aware where maybe a player's doing something in a practice and they're having an off day or something's going on. I like to know that I might know of all right, this maybe what's going on with this player. Is there something in their personal life? And I like to always have this be attuned to my players and my staff and bring this more humanistic element into the science of coaching. Because I think a lot of people see me and they're like, all right, science, CLA, analytics, like trying to incorporate analytics in this coach. But for me, it's actually more of those softer skills, like we're talking about being a transformational coach, that I actually think my skills there maybe are greater than CLA, analytics, all of that stuff. And I've still got a lot of room to grow.
A trait you would like to have as a coach?
Great question. So I'll do a longer question. We did staff development plans at the London Lions every 3 months for my team and for myself. And I think some things I struggle with, and it kind of was the same at prep, was sometimes I try to please everyone on the staff. And I think sometimes the ability to be more direct and not so nice in certain scenarios and just give a message that needs to be said without trying to delay it or not say it at all would help. So that it's a very specific rate limiter, just in terms of me more managing an organization, where I'm sometimes too focused on trying to make sure everyone's really enjoying the process, where sometimes I think you need a more direct, challenging conversation at the right time. I think another one would just be, I would really like to focus this season on really becoming comfortable linking scouting, shoot around, practice time, game execution into kind of one very systematic process where things we're planning in a shoot around in the practice, in a scout report, I'm able to identify these things in real time, create constraints for them, and then in the game really know what I'm paying attention to from those scouts, shoots arounds, etc. So I think there's always something to Marty. Like those are 2 things I've given you, but we should always be finding something new every year. I think if we're actually growing as coaches, probably a new rate limiter should be coming up.
Something new or doing something better?
I think it depends, because sometimes your rate limiter could be doing something that you do really well, but doing it in a world-class manner. Whereas sometimes it could be addressing something that you don't do that well and making it average. And I think that's where it depends completely on context, where you're at, etc.
I always see in the quote of Gustav Mahler that say that tradition is the worship of fire, the preservation of fire, not the worship of ashes. And there are many, Pep Guardiola said that he was a coach because the days before a match when he was analyzing the opponent, there was a moment watching the video, sometimes it was with the first video, sometimes it was with the fourth one, that he felt something like, okay, I have it. We win tomorrow. That was the moment that he said give a meaning to his profession.
Yeah, I see that.
What's your Guardiola moment?
I could actually see that so that was in the context of scouting, right? You were saying he was like watching an opponent or something.
Preparing the
game. I've actually had a few moments like that. And I think in basketball, you get that when you look at the game through a CLA lens, because you see something so specific that you could explain. And then you have the tools to embed that properly in a shoot around in a practice, and you're confident your players can exploit it. But probably my Guardiola moment more, in a zoomed out setting would really just be understanding CLA. And I think that's the greatest competitive advantage, making proper usage of that.
The most appreciated achievement. It can be material, emotional, wherever.
I'd say college prep Italy, or maybe this camp. I'd say two reasons why. College prep, because I showed what can be done. It was one of the first programs in the world to go CLA in everything. Basketball, weight room, physio, film. So I was very proud of that, because I know we helped and inspired a lot of coaches. And more importantly, we really helped the players get to places they wouldn't have been without us. And the relationships we developed were very authentic. And the camp, I say the camp because...
Alex, before going to the camp, so you were preparing players to go to the States?
Correct.
How was there once they finished college prep and went to the States, some kind of shock, any kind of problems?
Yeah, huge shock. And it was the hardest thing of running it, was knowing that they were going from the environment we had to the dominant approach. And, there's some great college coaches, don't get me wrong, but it's different, right?
I think something you say, it's you can be from the dominant approach, but well-intentioned.
Yeah, absolutely.
But
absolutely.
Sorry, you were saying...
So no, I'd say that was the greatest challenge. And two, just in terms of having college coaches appreciate European players, it was very difficult, because we had some exceptional players who were so skilled, but they didn't pass the eye test. So no one would give them a look, because coaches would just take one look at their highlight and assume that they couldn't do something without really looking at the player and who they were. So that would be one, and say this camp, because we've got, I think it's the largest meetup ever of CLA basketball coaches that we've ever seen in the world before, which is pretty cool. So we've got close to 60 coaches, if you include the staff, who all believe in transforming, who all believe in CLA, who all believe in transformational coaching. And we're literally come here to, watch the practices, have a workshop every evening to share ideas and to improve the game. And I think that's what gives me so much satisfaction, because I think transforming really motivates me, because I know it's having such a huge impact. And maybe just from the 60 coaches here, that's probably about 10,000 players, all the clubs. And I know that that's a huge number of players who are going to get a much greater experience of basketball. And that motivates me a lot. It really gives me the fuel to keep going with transforming and to keep spreading this message.
And honestly, for me, just sometimes impacting just one single person is priceless. And you can go in 10,000.
That's it.
How much harm causes the A test?
The A test?
The eye test, sorry. Because it looks bad. I remember in a camp, a shooter from academy of the Spanish top team came. He was the best shooter, but he had a form, if you compare it to the dominant one, very bad. The best shooter in the camp was the one who got more tips, more interventions in order to fix that.
It's coaching in a nutshell. We focus more on form and what we think things should look like as opposed to what works and what is effective.
And for me, it hurts a lot that lack of commitment of a person that can not destroy but affect so many lives.
Absolutely. And even at the highest level, you see players being given ridiculous information, like to shoot without dipping a basketball. That happens with NBA lottery picks. And it's incredible that can be happening at the highest levels without having systematic checks in place to ensure that players are actually getting really up-to-date modern coaching.
If I'm not wrong, I think it's what you say in some parts of the book, that some evaluations are based on assumptions that are not from basketball, are from synchronized swimming.
That's it. Exactly.
An unpopular opinion about training.
You know what? Let's go with, you took a great photo today at the camp, Marty. It was with one of our coaches, and he had a slogan on the back, and he said, imperfect practice makes for perfect. And, perfect doesn't even exist. I would say probably not, but the message is there. And I think if your players are not making mistakes in practice, if they're not looking bad in particular stretches, then as a coach, you probably haven't done your job as effectively as you could have if you were doing the alternative.
The credit goes to Jaime Sampaio. I just
that
copied.
was it.
A person towards who do you feel gratitude, but you never said thank you?
Oh, that's a great question. You know what? I'd say all the coaches on social media who have supported my ideas, because that means a lot. And I think as a person, I think that everyone who's impacted me knows how much I'm grateful for their support. And I'm quite intentional with overdoing thank yous because I genuinely mean it. But I think just, for people online who have supported me through transforming, where it's just liking a video, giving a nice comment, sending a message, buying the book. I think that to me, I'm very grateful for because it shows there's interest. It shows that there's open-minded coaches out there who want to change the status quo and modernize coaching and create a better opportunity for players, irregardless of if they're beginners or pros. So I'd probably say that it's because those are the people who maybe a lot of them I haven't met. Probably 99% of coaches who support us at Transforming I haven't met. And it's those people who I'm grateful for.
During the Transforming basketball path, have you had like dark stages?
Dark stages ago, I had a dark stage this week when our whole website crashed for like 4 days and hundreds of people were trying to get on the membership that we just released. And I had no clear answer, but no, seriously, I think, you have ups and downs in all parts of life. It's normal and you're not going to be good every day coaching. But I think my goal of life is not to coach at a certain level. Like I'm not going to say, I want to be a head coach in the NBA. I want to impact as many other coaches as possible and help them. And that's actually what drives me the most. That drives me far more than anything extrinsic like a job title or money. I think it's just the way I am. And I'm fortunate because now I'm getting to coach in the NBA and I'm getting to tick that box. But I think at the end of the day, what it always comes down to with me is, am I helping people? Am I helping coaches? And that's what drives me. I think it's a tough one because professional sports, it's just so transactional. It's just the nature of the industry. It's all about winning. But I think as a person, I'm very positive in general with my outlook. So of course I'm going to have days I'm not feeling so good. I'm going to have low days. But overall, I like to think that I'm a very positive, optimistic person, sometimes too optimistic. But I think sometimes that acts as a strength in some regards. So yeah, that's what I'd say to that question.
Many times when I saw you coaching, I said, shit, he has understood it. Because many times for me, the obsession on papers or science or proven things has made me think that that was the way, no? And then sometimes you didn't pay attention to what you transmit, the emotion, self-efficacy. But man, you do that so good.
Oh, thank you, Marty. I appreciate that.
A person you would like to have the chance to learn from?
Well, that's a great question. I would love to watch some really high level coaches in other sports. If they're doing CLA, great, but maybe there could be other things that would be really interesting that I could pick up from them. So you've had some great coaches on this podcast. So guys like Craig Morris in canoe slalom. Well, that would be fascinating to see how he runs a practice. You got Jordi Fernandez on from Venezia. I'd love to see how they do things. So I think that's the hardest thing with professional sports. There's so little time. So often coaches, when they do have time off, they obviously want to relax. And I think that's the advantage I had before at college prep. I had all the time in the world to go and learn from these people. So I'd be really interested to see how I can find a way to try and keep that up now, because it's such a huge advantage when you can see others in other sports and just take a step back from your own context.
A grateful or necessary failure you had?
Necessary failures would be all the time not getting jobs that you're going for. It happened a lot this summer before the great opportunity I had that came up recently. There are 2 jobs that came up that I was pretty confident about, and I didn't get it. I didn't get them. And that was the most motivated I've probably been in 5 years after that. I'd say I was so tenacious for the weeks after that. And it was really good to feel like that. I was actually really grateful I didn't get the jobs for that reason. It was good to feel that feeling and have that burn again. And then probably before I wrote about it in the book, I was fired from an academy in Belgium during COVID, where I went to do all this stuff. And then, it's normal. I understand why. It's not everyone's cup of tea. The academy director couldn't handle it. It really clashed with how they viewed the game. But it was great because being fired from there was what led to Italy, which led to transforming all these opportunities now. So I think every setback you have, that's what coaching is. It's definitely not the last time I'm going to be fired in my whole career. Probably the first and many times. So it's good because those opportunities always give you an opportunity to learn from it, evaluate it, and take new things into wherever you go next.
Who was multifactorial, but in Belgium, who made the mistake? You? They didn't understand you? They didn't have patience?
I'd say both parties, because I think, at the time, my knowledge of CLA was so limited compared to now, and I probably couldn't explain it as well. Probably couldn't build the relationship as well as I could now. And obviously, it's both sides always to a story, but I think you've always got to look. I think if you always look at something and you just say, "Oh, it's not my fault," it's kind of like a losing mentality. And I think I like to look at everything from, all right, what could I have done differently? Or,
you shouldn't market the transforming basketball and CLA. You should market your way of thinking, your way of feeling, how you manage to make others feel better.
Yeah.
A contradiction of what you believe and what you do.
Okay, I'll say this. Here's a great example. This week we've got it's human movement, right? I'm so interested in human movement, and I've been studying lots of like athletic performance recently, but then I've never been applying it, doing it myself. So this is actually one of my biggest goals over the next year. Like we had Josef Fucek here from Fighting Monkey, world leading movement coach. And, I would love to be able to actually not just learn about it, but actually to start doing it. So, because obviously it's all aligned to ecological dynamics. So that's one part of me that I really want to explore over the next year, actually doing the things that I've been learning about with athletic performance and human movement.
A doubt or a question you have in mind?
I mean, I have questions every week, Marty. And the thing is, I'm very I have no doubts in sending them to a researcher, sending them to someone on Twitter, so I think I'm always coming up with very specific questions based on whatever I'm interested in that week. I'd say doubts, that's a great one. And I'd say doubts would be, and it's very recent, balancing growth in a professional career as a coach in, NBA, Europe, whatever, balancing that with what I think is my mission to help spread this and help coaches and educate them. And right now I'm really fortunate that my main focus is on my job, but my staff at Transforming are doing an amazing job carrying the torch while I'm obviously coaching. But I think my doubt will be what happens in a few years. Like, will there be one path that I have to really just do and cut everything else? And what one would it be? And I think that would be a really difficult decision to explore. So how I view it is, using the next few years to figure that out and really be sure of what it is that drives me. And then we'll see in a few years what my answer will be.
A change of belief that you would highlight.
Dominant to CLA or games-based approach to CLA 5 years ago.
A challenge you have to fulfill.
So the big challenge to me, Marty, was showing that you could do this at the highest level, because I think I've done this at multiple levels. So now that's my goal for the next 2 years. I want to show how successful the CLA can be in an NBA setting.
And the last one, a life motto.
Okay, let's link this to the transformational coaching piece, which we spoke about earlier. And I think this is a good one to end on. And it was what I said to the coaches yesterday. And I said, because obviously most of the coaches listening to this will probably be youth coaches or whatever. And I said, don't ever be a child's last coach, and make sure that you make practice the best part of their day. And I just think if more coaches approach their practices, their days with that motto, sport would be the transformative experience that it should be, as unfortunately being the transactional experience that we see in a bunch of sports at all levels.
Alex, I'd love to finish our chat with this quote. I appreciate a lot what you have done for the community. I appreciate a lot how have you treated me as a person and as a coach these days here. And I wish you can continue to transform many synchronized swimming coaches in a basketball court to basketball coaches. Thank you very much.
A pleasure, Marty. Thanks for everything. It's an amazing podcast. I love listening to all the episodes. So I'm so glad we can make this happen.
You made my day.
Thank you.
Go to fosburyflop.blog to check the notes of the episode, its written version, and much more content. If you want to support the project through the website, you can make Fosbury Flop possible and check what benefits you get.